Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that existed centuries ago. A world of silk screens and paper lanterns, of carefully choreographed rituals and unspoken hierarchies. We're going to explore what life was really like for a concubine in feudal Japan. And trust me, it's nothing like what you might have seen in movies or read in romanticized novels. This is a story about real women who lived in the shadows of power, women whose lives were defined by duty, survival, and the complex web of relationships within the great households of samurai lords and shoguns. We'll walk through an entire day, from the moment the first light touches the shoji screens to the quiet hours of the night when the household finally sleeps. But we won't stop there. We'll also explore the broader context of their world, the customs, the expectations, the rare moments of joy, and the constant awareness of their precarious position in society. So get comfortable, because we're about to spend the next few hours in feudal Japan, experiencing a life that was both privileged and constrained, luxurious and lonely, fascinating and heartbreaking. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The first thing you need to understand about being a concubine in feudal Japan is that your day didn't belong to you. It never really had, not since the moment you entered the household, whether you were purchased, given as a gift, or placed there by your own family seeking to improve their fortunes. Your life was governed by a complex system of rules, both written and unwritten, and every moment of your day was structured around the needs, desires, and schedules of others. The household you served was likely that of a daimyo, a powerful feudal lord, or perhaps a wealthy merchant who had risen high enough in society to maintain a household that mimicked the aristocracy. Either way, you were part of an intricate social machine, and your role, while it came with certain comforts, was ultimately one of service and availability. Let's say our concubine's name is Hana. It's not her birth name, of course. Like most concubines, she was given a new name when she entered the household, something poetic and pleasing, something that reflected the aesthetic preferences of her lord. Hana means flower, and it suits the image she's expected to project: beautiful, delicate, ornamental, and ultimately temporary, because flowers fade and seasons change. Hana is 22 years old, which means she's been in this household for 6 years now, having arrived when she was 16. She came from a minor samurai family that had fallen on hard times, and her father, faced with debts and declining prospects, made an arrangement with the lord of this domain. Hana was educated enough to be acceptable in an aristocratic household. She could read and write. She knew poetry, she could play the koto with reasonable skill, and she had been taught the basics of tea ceremony. These accomplishments made her valuable, more than just a pretty face, though her appearance certainly didn't hurt her prospects. The room where Hana sleeps is small but not uncomfortable. It's located in a wing of the compound that houses several other concubines and ladies-in-waiting, a section of the estate that's clearly separated from the main family quarters, but still within the protected inner grounds. The room has tatami mat flooring, of course, and the walls are made of wooden frames covered with paper screens that let in diffused light during the day. At night, These screens create an illusion of privacy, though everyone knows that true privacy doesn't exist in a household like this. Conversations carry through paper walls, and there are always servants moving through the corridors, always someone who might hear or see something that could become valuable information or dangerous gossip. Hana wakes before dawn, not because she has to, but because her body has learned the rhythms of the household over the years. There's a certain quality to the darkness just before morning, a particular stillness that she's come to recognize. Outside, she can hear the first stirrings of the servants who work in the kitchens, the soft sounds of footsteps on wooden walkways, the distant clatter of a pot or bucket. The household is massive, employing dozens of people, and it takes considerable effort to keep it running smoothly. Hana lies still for a moment on her futon, the quilted bedding warm around her, and she thinks about the day ahead. She has no official duties until later in the morning, but there are still things she must do, preparations she must make, because being a concubine is not just about the hours you spend in your lord's presence. It's about maintaining yourself as a valuable asset, keeping yourself refined, educated, beautiful, and interesting. She rises slowly, careful not to disturb the careful arrangement of her sleeping space. Everything in her room has its place, and she's learned to be meticulous about maintaining order. Disorder in your personal space can be interpreted as disorder in your character, and in a household where you're constantly being observed and evaluated, you cannot afford such interpretations. She folds her bedding with precise movements, storing it in the cabinet built into the wall, then opens the small window screen to let in the pre-dawn air. It's early autumn, and the air carries a crispness that speaks of changing seasons. In the garden beyond her window, she can see the shadowy shapes of carefully pruned trees and the glint of a stone lantern. Her first task is purification. There's a small washing area attached to her room, a luxury not all the concubines enjoy, and she uses it now, pouring cold water from a ceramic basin over her hands and face. The water is shockingly cold, and it drives away the last remnants of sleep. She pats her face dry with a cotton cloth, then sits before her mirror to begin the lengthy process of preparing her appearance. This is not vanity, though outsiders might interpret it that way. This is work. Her appearance is her currency in this household, and she must invest time and effort into maintaining it. Her hair is long, reaching past her waist when unbound, and it's thick and dark, one of the features that first caught her lord's attention. She brushes it carefully, counting the strokes the way she was taught, using a wooden comb that's been in her possession since she arrived here. The repetitive motion is almost meditative, and as she works, her mind wanders through the day ahead. She knows that her lord has been preoccupied lately with matters of administration. There's been some dispute with a neighboring domain over water rights, and he's been spending long hours in council with his advisors. This means she probably won't be summoned to his quarters tonight, which is both a relief and a disappointment. A relief, because these sessions can be exhausting in ways that have nothing to do with physical intimacy. Her lord is an intelligent man, but he's also moody and demanding, and when he's stressed about political matters, he can be difficult to please. A disappointment, because if she's not summoned, if too much time passes between summons, she begins to worry about her position. Are you being forgotten? Are you being replaced? These are the anxieties that plague every concubine, the awareness that you are ultimately replaceable. After brushing her hair, she arranges it in a simple style appropriate for the morning hours. Later, if she's summoned, she'll arrange it more elaborately, but for now, she twists it into a practical bun at the nape of her neck and secures it with plain wooden pins. Then she turns her attention to her face. The ideal of beauty in this era is very specific. Pale skin is paramount, so she applies a light layer of white powder, not the thick coating that courtesans wear, but enough to lighten and even her complexion. She darkens her eyebrows slightly with charcoal, shaping them into elegant arches. There's a small pot of rouge that she uses sparingly on her lips and the corners of her eyes, just enough to add a hint of color without looking obvious. The goal is to look naturally beautiful, effortlessly refined, even though every element of this appearance requires effort and artifice. By the time she's finished, the sun is beginning to rise, casting pale light through the paper screens. She can hear more activity now in the corridors outside her room. The household is waking up, preparing for the day ahead. She selects her clothing carefully from the cabinet where her garments are stored. She has several kimono, each appropriate for different occasions and seasons. This morning, she chooses one in a muted gray-blue color, decorated with a subtle pattern of autumn grasses. It's made of silk, but not the heavy, ornate silk reserved for formal occasions. This is everyday elegance, the kind of clothing that marks her as someone of status within the household without being ostentatious. She layers it carefully over her undergarments, wrapping and tying it with practiced efficiency, then secures it with a simple obi in a darker blue. The process of dressing is another ritual, another series of precise movements that she's performed so many times they've become automatic. Once she's dressed and has made a final check of her appearance, she slides open the door of her room and steps out into the corridor. The wooden floors are cool under her feet, even through her tabi socks. She makes her way through the residence, moving through corridors that are beginning to fill with morning light. The architecture of the compound is designed to reflect the social hierarchy of its inhabitants. The lord's quarters are in the center, elevated and protected. The main wife's quarters are nearby, substantial and well-appointed. Then there are the quarters for the lord's mother, if she's still living, and his adult children. The concubine's quarters are in a separate wing, nice enough to reflect the lord's wealth and taste, but distinctly secondary. You're reminded every day of your place in this hierarchy just by moving through the physical space of the compound. Hana's first destination is the small shrine that's been set up in a corner of the concubine's wing. It's a simple altar with offerings of incense, flowers, and rice cakes, and it's maintained by the women who live in this part of the compound. She kneels before it and offers a brief prayer, asking for continued favor, for health, for protection. She's not particularly religious, but these rituals are important. They provide structure and meaning, and they're also opportunities to demonstrate proper behavior, because in a household like this, someone is always watching, always making mental notes about who performs their duties and who neglects them. After her prayers, she makes her way to the common room where the concubines gather for breakfast. This room is larger than their individual sleeping chambers, with several low tables arranged on tatami mats and cushions for sitting. When Hana arrives, two other women are already there. There's Yuki, who's been in the household for nearly a decade and is probably in her early 30s now, and Suzume, a newer arrival who's only been here for about a year and is still learning the unwritten rules of this small society. The relationship between the concubines is complex. They're not exactly friends because they're fundamentally in competition with each other for the Lord's attention and favor. But they're not enemies either because they share a situation that no one else in the household truly understands. They exist in a strange middle ground, bound by common experience and mutual dependence, but always aware of the underlying competition. They exchange greetings, and Hana takes her place at one of the tables. A servant brings their breakfast, which consists of rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, and a small portion of grilled fish. It's good food, nourishing and well prepared, reflecting the household's prosperity. They eat in relative silence, which is the custom for morning meals. Conversation at breakfast is considered inappropriate, too stimulating for the beginning of the day. So they eat quietly, and Hana lets her mind wander again. She's thinking about a poem she's been composing, something about autumn leaves and the passage of time. Poetry is more than just a hobby for her. It's a skill that increases her value. Her lord appreciates cultured conversation, and being able to compose an elegant poem or quote an appropriate classical verse can mean the difference between a pleasant evening and a disappointing one. After breakfast, the women disperse to attend to their various activities. Yuki mentions that she has a calligraphy lesson scheduled, something she's been working on to improve her already considerable skills. Suzume is going to practice her shamisen, the three-stringed instrument that's popular for entertainment. Hana decides to spend some time in the garden. There's a small courtyard garden accessible from their wing of the compound, and it's one of the few spaces where they can go outside without needing permission or an escort. The garden is beautiful, designed according to classical principles with carefully placed rocks, a small pond with koi fish, and meticulously pruned trees and shrubs. There's a stone path that winds through it, and several benches placed at strategic points where you can sit and contemplate the view. Hana settles onto one of these benches, arranging her kimono carefully so it doesn't wrinkle or get soiled. The morning air is fresh and cool, and she can hear birds singing in the trees. This is one of the few times in her day when she can simply exist without performing a role, without being conscious of being observed and evaluated. She watches the koi moving lazily through the pond water, their orange and white bodies flashing in the dappled sunlight that filters through the trees. She thinks about her family, something she tries not to do too often because it makes her melancholy. She wonders how her younger sister is doing, whether she's married yet, whether the family's fortunes have improved. She was allowed to send a letter home once, about a year after she arrived, carefully worded to express contentment and gratitude without revealing anything that might reflect poorly on the household. She received a brief reply from her father, formal and distant, thanking her for her service to the family. That was the last direct communication she had with them. The truth is, she exists now in a kind of limbo. She's no longer really part of her birth family. She's been removed from that context and placed into a new one, but she can never fully belong to this household either. She's not the wife. She's not family. She's something else, something that doesn't have a comfortable name or clear category. She's valuable property, perhaps, though it makes her uncomfortable to frame it that way. She's a luxury item, a reflection of her lord's wealth and status. She's also a real person with thoughts and feelings and desires, but those aspects of herself are not particularly relevant to her role in this household. After spending about an hour in the garden, she returns to her room to continue her preparations for the day. She has a calligraphy set, and she spends some time practicing characters, working on the flowing, elegant style that's currently fashionable. Her handwriting is already quite good, but there's always room for improvement, and besides, the practice is calming. The rhythm of preparing the ink, loading the brush, forming each character with careful strokes, it's almost meditative. She's working on copying a famous poem, something by a classical Chinese poet that her lord particularly admires. If she creates a particularly good piece, she might present it to him as a gift, a way of reminding him of her presence and her cultivation. Calligraphy is considered one of the highest art forms in feudal Japan, intimately connected with literacy, education, and aesthetic sensibility. The ability to write beautifully is not just a practical skill, but a moral and spiritual accomplishment, reflecting the inner character of the writer. The classical saying goes that calligraphy is the person, meaning that your handwriting reveals your true nature. A person with good character will naturally produce beautiful, harmonious calligraphy, while a person with flaws or deficiencies will reveal them through awkward or unbalanced writing. Whether or not this belief is actually true, it exerts powerful influence over how people approach the art and how they judge the work of others. The materials used in calligraphy are themselves objects of considerable attention and care. The paper, or washi, is handmade from plant fibers, typically mulberry, and has a distinctive texture and absorbency that affects how the ink spreads and settles. Different papers are appropriate for different styles of writing and different occasions. Hana has access to several types of paper, stored carefully in her cabinet to protect them from moisture and insects. The ink, or sumi, comes in solid sticks that must be ground against a stone with water to produce liquid ink. The process of grinding the ink is itself a form of meditation, requiring patience and producing a subtle variation in ink quality depending on how much water is used and how long you grind. The brush, or feud, is made from animal hair, typically from horses, goats, or weasels, and different brushes are suited to different styles and sizes of writing. Hana's calligraphy practice this morning focuses on copying a poem by the Tang Dynasty Chinese poet Du Fu, one of the most revered poets in the East Asian literary tradition. The poem she's working with is about autumn, about the passage of time, and the melancholy beauty of changing seasons. It's a theme that resonates deeply with her own experience, this awareness of time passing, of beauty being temporary, of life being a series of losses mixed with occasional moments of grace. As she writes each character, she tries to capture not just the shape, but the spirit of the words, to make her calligraphy a genuine interpretation of the poem rather than just a mechanical copy. The Chinese characters used in classical poetry are dense with meaning and allusion. Each character is not just a sound or a word, but a complex symbol with multiple layers of significance. Some characters combine elements that create new meanings through juxtaposition. Others reference classical texts or historical events that an educated reader would recognize. When Hana writes the character for autumn, for instance, she's writing a symbol that combines the pictographic elements for grain and fire, suggesting the harvest season when fields are burned after the crops are gathered. This character carries with it not just the abstract idea of autumn, but specific sensory and cultural associations. The smell of burning straw, the golden color of ripe grain, the shorter days, and cooling temperatures. As she works on her calligraphy, Hana is aware that she's participating in a tradition that stretches back over 1,000 years. The poem she's copying was written in the 8th century by a Chinese poet. It was transmitted to Japan and studied by generations of Japanese scholars and artists. It has been copied countless times, interpreted in countless different calligraphic styles, used as a subject for painting and commentary. By engaging with this poem, by adding her own interpretation through her calligraphy, Hana is connecting herself to this vast tradition, claiming a place within it, however modest. This gives her work significance beyond its immediate practical purpose of demonstrating her skills to her lord. She's participating in culture, adding her small contribution to the ongoing conversation about beauty, meaning, and artistic excellence. She completes several drafts of the poem, each one slightly different as she experiments with the spacing, the weight of the lines, the balance of the composition on the page. She examines each version critically, looking for the one that best captures what she's trying to express. Some are too stiff, too controlled, lacking the spontaneous vitality that good calligraphy should have. Others are too loose, too casual, not showing enough discipline and structure. Finally, she produces one that satisfies her, where all the elements come together in harmonious balance. She sets it aside to dry, and later she'll mount it on a backing and perhaps present it to her lord at an appropriate moment. The act of creating this piece of calligraphy has taken her well over an hour, but the time has passed quickly, absorbed as she's been in the work. This complete absorption in a skilled activity, what modern psychology might call a flow state, is one of the great pleasures of Hana's life. When she's fully engaged in calligraphy, or music, or even in performing tea ceremony, she loses her ordinary self-consciousness, forgets about her anxieties and calculations, and simply exists in the activity. These moments are rare and precious, brief respites from the constant vigilance that characterizes most of her existence. Around mid-morning, there's a knock on her doorframe, and she calls out permission to enter. One of the senior servants appears, a woman named Ume, who manages much of the day-to-day administration of the concubines wing. Ume informs her that she's been requested to attend a tea gathering later in the afternoon. These gatherings are semi-formal affairs where several of the household's women come together, sometimes including the lord's wife, sometimes just the concubines and ladies-in-waiting. They're ostensibly about appreciating tea and the ceremony surrounding it, but they're really about maintaining social connections and demonstrating refinement. Hana thanks Ume for the information and asks if there's any particular protocol she should be aware of. Ume tells her that the lord's wife will be attending, which means Hana needs to be especially careful about her behavior and appearance. The relationship between concubines and the legitimate wife is always delicate. Some wives are relatively accepting of the situation, understanding it as a normal part of elite household management. Others are resentful and look for opportunities to humiliate or diminish the concubines. Hana's lord's wife falls somewhere in the middle. She's not openly hostile, but she's also not warm, and she expects strict deference and perfect etiquette. The legitimate wife's position in the household is worth exploring in more detail because understanding her role helps illuminate the complexity of the concubine's situation. The wife, whose name is Lady Takahashi, came to this household as a bride when she was only 15 years old, part of a strategic marriage alliance between two samurai families. Her marriage was arranged by her parents and the lord's parents, with political and economic considerations taking precedence over personal compatibility. She met her husband for the first time on their wedding day, and she had to immediately adapt to life in his household, under the watchful and critical eye of his mother, who was still alive at that time and wielded considerable power. Lady Takahashi's early years in the household were difficult. She was young, far from her own family, and uncertain of her position. She was young, far from her own family, and uncertain of her position. Her mother-in-law was demanding and often critical, finding fault with her management of household affairs, her deportment, even her failure to immediately produce a son. The Lord himself was often absent, occupied with his duties, and when he was present, he was formal and distant. Their intimate relationship was awkward and unsatisfying for both of them, more about duty than desire. Lady Takahashi felt lonely and overwhelmed, struggling to meet expectations she didn't always understand. She did eventually bear children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, and this solidified her position considerably. As the mother of the heirs, she became indispensable to the household, and her status improved accordingly. Her mother-in-law gradually ceded power to her, and she became the actual manager of the household's domestic affairs, controlling budgets, directing servants, overseeing the education of the children. This power brought its own satisfactions, but it also brought burdens and responsibilities that were sometimes crushing. The arrival of concubines in the household was something Lady Takahashi had known to expect, but knowledge didn't make it easy to accept. The first concubine arrived when Lady Takahashi was in her mid-20s, and she felt it as a personal rejection, evidence that she was inadequate, that her husband preferred other women. She had to watch as he spent time with this other woman, knowing that they were sharing intimacies, fearing that he might develop genuine affection for the concubine that he had never shown for his legitimate wife. She had to maintain her dignity and composure while feeling angry and hurt, had to treat the concubine with formal correctness while resenting her existence. Over the years, Lady Takahashi has developed various strategies for dealing with the concubines. She maintains emotional distance from them, treating them as servants rather than as rivals or potential allies. She exercises her power over them in small ways, controlling their access to resources, monitoring their behavior, occasionally reminding them of their subordinate status through minor humiliations. She's never openly cruel, because that would be beneath her dignity and would reflect poorly on the household, but she's also never warm or generous. The concubines understand that they must constantly defer to her, must never challenge her authority, must accept whatever slights or restrictions she chooses to impose. At the same time, Lady Takahashi has her own vulnerabilities and insecurities. She's now in her 40s, and she knows that her husband finds younger women more attractive. She's fulfilled her reproductive duty, but that doesn't protect her from the awareness that she's aging, that her beauty is fading, that her husband might prefer the company of concubines who are still young and lovely. She maintains her position through her role as mother and household manager, through her family connections and her status as legitimate wife, but she knows that affection and desire are elsewhere. This knowledge is painful, even after all these years, even though she's learned to live with it. Lady Takahashi's relationship with her children is complex as well. She loves them, of course, but her love is filtered through the requirements of her role. She raised them according to strict principles, emphasizing duty, discipline, and proper behavior. She was not demonstrative or openly affectionate because such behavior was considered inappropriate and harmful to character development. Her sons were handed over to male tutors and mentors at a young age, and her contact with them became increasingly formal as they grew older. Her daughters received more of her attention as she personally supervised their education in the domestic arts, but even these relationships were shaped by the formality and hierarchy of their world. Now that her children are adults with their own households and responsibilities, they treat her with respect and deference, but there's little warmth or intimacy in their interactions. The tea gathering this afternoon represents for Lady Takahashi an opportunity to assert her authority and to evaluate the concubines. She will be watching them carefully, noting any lapses in etiquette, any signs of presumption or improper behavior. She will also be demonstrating her own superior cultivation, her perfect mastery of tea ceremony and social grace. The gathering is, in a sense, a performance for all the women involved, but the stakes are highest for the concubines, who are always being evaluated and whose positions are never entirely secure. With this new information, Hana adjusts her plans for the day. She'll need to change into a more formal kimono for the tea gathering, and she'll need to prepare herself mentally for several hours of extremely careful social performance. Tea gatherings can be exhausting because every gesture, every word, every expression is laden with meaning and potential judgment. You have to be graceful, but not showy, refined, but not pretentious, present, but not dominating. It's a tightrope walk, and one small mistake can have lasting consequences. She spends the next few hours in her room, alternating between calligraphy practice and review of tea ceremony protocols. She goes over in her mind the proper way to handle each implement, the correct phrases to use when complimenting the tea or the utensils, the appropriate timing for each movement. She's participated in many of these ceremonies over the years, but she never assumes she can just show up unprepared. Complacency is dangerous in her position. The tea ceremony itself is an art form that took centuries to develop and refine. Its origins trace back to China, where tea drinking was already an established custom by the time it was introduced to Japan in the 9th century. Initially, tea was consumed primarily by Buddhist monks, who valued its ability to help them stay awake during long meditation sessions. The preparation and consumption of tea gradually became more ritualized, incorporating Zen Buddhist principles of mindfulness, simplicity, and attention to the present moment. By the 16th century, tea ceremony had evolved into the highly codified practice that Hana is preparing for now. Every aspect of the ceremony has meaning and significance, from the architecture of the tea house to the selection of utensils, from the movements of the host to the responses of the guests. The tea ceremony Hana will participate in today follows the tradition established by the great tea masters of previous centuries. These masters understood tea ceremony not merely as a social occasion, but as a form of spiritual practice, a way of creating harmony and tranquility in a world often characterized by conflict and chaos. The four principles that govern tea ceremony are harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. Harmony refers to the relationship between the host and guests, and between humans and nature. Respect encompasses the proper treatment of utensils and the courteous behavior toward others. Purity involves both physical cleanliness and spiritual clarity. Tranquility is the ultimate goal, the state of peaceful awareness that the ceremony is designed to cultivate. For a concubine like Hana, participating in tea ceremony serves multiple purposes. On the surface, it's a demonstration of cultural refinement, evidence that she possesses the skills and knowledge expected of an educated woman in her position. But on a deeper level, the ceremony provides her with rare moments of genuine mindfulness and peace. The highly structured nature of the ritual, paradoxically, creates a space where she can let go of the constant vigilance and self-consciousness that characterizes most of her life. When she's focused on the precise angle of the tea bowl, the sound of water being poured, the subtle aroma of the matcha, she's not worried about her status or her future. She's simply present in the moment, which is both a relief and a kind of luxury. The utensils used in tea ceremony are themselves objects of considerable aesthetic and monetary value. The tea bowl, or chawan, might be a treasured piece created by a famous potter, passed down through generations, or acquired at great expense. The tea caddy, or natsume, where the powdered tea is stored, might be made of lacquered wood decorated with gold leaf. The tea scoop, or chashaku, though simple in appearance, is carved from bamboo according to specific proportions and has its own name and history. The tea whisk, or chazen, is crafted from a single piece of bamboo split into dozens of fine tines. Even the cloth used to wipe the utensils, the fukusa, is made of silk and folded according to precise methods. All of these objects are handled with reverence during the ceremony, and guests are expected to admire and comment on them appropriately. Hana knows the proper way to admire each type of utensil. When the tea bowl is passed to her, she will first bow to acknowledge the gift of tea, then she will raise the bowl slightly to show respect. She will rotate it in her hands, examining the glaze, the shape, the weight, the feel of it. She knows to look for the front of the bowl, which is typically the side with the most interesting pattern or the potter's mark, and she knows to rotate the bowl so that she drinks from the side, not the front, out of respect for the artistry. After drinking, she will wipe the rim with her fingers and then examine the bowl again, perhaps commenting on some aspect of its beauty or craftsmanship. All of this must be done with grace and without affectation, showing genuine appreciation while maintaining proper form. The psychological preparation for tea ceremony is as important as the practical preparation. Hana must clear her mind of distracting thoughts and emotions, must cultivate an attitude of openness and receptivity. She cannot bring anxiety or resentment into the tea room.
The whole point of the ceremony is to create a temporary world of harmony and peace, separate from the conflicts and complications of ordinary life.
If she fails to achieve this inner state, it will show in her movements and expressions, will disrupt the atmosphere, and will reflect poorly on her training and character. So she takes time before the ceremony to breathe deeply, to center herself, to let go of whatever concerns might be occupying her mind. She thinks of a phrase she learned from a Buddhist text about the importance of being fully present in each moment, and she tries to embody this principle as she prepares. Around noon, a light lunch is delivered to her room. It's simpler than breakfast, just rice balls with pickled plum and some vegetables, but it's perfectly adequate. She eats slowly, making sure not to spill anything on her clothing, then takes some time to rest. This is one of the survival skills she's learned during her years here. When you have the opportunity to rest, you take it, because you never know when you might be called upon to be charming and entertaining for hours at a stretch. In the early afternoon, she begins preparing for the tea gathering. She changes into a more formal kimono, this one in a deep green color, decorated with a pattern of chrysanthemums and flowing water. The fabric is heavier, the embroidery more elaborate. She spends extra time on her hair, arranging it in a more complex style with several ornamental pins. She refreshes her makeup, making sure everything is perfect. Then she adds a few small accessories, a delicate fan tucked into her obi, a scent sachet that releases a subtle fragrance. She checks herself in the mirror one final time, turning to view her appearance from different angles, making minute adjustments until she's satisfied that she presents the ideal image. When the time comes, she makes her way to the tea house, which is located in a different part of the compound near one of the larger gardens. The tea house is a separate structure, built according to traditional principles. It's small and deliberately rustic in its aesthetic, with rough wooden posts and a thatched roof, even though it's actually quite new and was built by the finest craftsmen. This rustic simplicity is an affectation, a studied artlessness that's actually the product of considerable wealth and taste. The path to the tea house takes her through a carefully maintained garden, past a stone water basin where guests are supposed to ritually cleanse their hands and mouths before entering. When she arrives, several other women are already there, waiting in the small preparation area outside the tea house proper. She recognizes them all, Yuki and Suzume, of course, two ladies-in-waiting who serve the Lord's wife, and the wife herself, who's seated slightly apart from the others in a position that emphasizes her superior status. Hana approaches and bows deeply to the wife, offering the appropriate greeting. The wife acknowledges her with a small nod, her face revealing nothing. The wife is perhaps 40 years old, still handsome, dressed in a magnificent kimono that's undoubtedly worth more than everything Hana owns. She has the unmistakable bearing of someone who was born into this class, who never had to learn these manners because she absorbed them from birth. They wait in silence until the tea master, an elderly woman who's been with the household for decades, indicates that they should enter. They remove their outdoor footwear and enter the tea house through the small door that requires them to bend down, a gesture of humility that's part of the ceremony. Inside, the space is dim and tranquil. There's a small alcove with a hanging scroll and a simple flower arrangement, and the tatami mats are immaculate. They take their seats in order of rank, with the wife in the position of honor, the ladies-in-waiting next, and the concubines last. Hana settles into her place, kneeling on the mat with her legs tucked beneath her, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She knows she'll be in this position for at least an hour, probably longer, and she's already steeling herself against the discomfort that will inevitably come. The ceremony proceeds according to ancient protocols. The tea master prepares the matcha with deliberate, graceful movements, whisking the green powder with hot water until it froths. She serves the wife first, presenting the bowl with careful attention to its positioning. The wife admires the bowl, rotating it to view the pattern, then takes a sip and offers the appropriate compliment about the tea's flavor. Then the bowl is passed, and each woman in turn performs the same ritual, admiring, sipping, complimenting. When the bowl reaches Hana, she's extremely conscious of being watched. She holds the bowl correctly, rotates it the proper number of times, sips with the right amount of sound to indicate appreciation, and offers a compliment that's sincere without being effusive. Then she wipes the rim of the bowl with the small cloth provided and passes it to the next person. The matcha tea itself is quite different from the tea most people in feudal Japan would have consumed. Ordinary people, to the extent they drank tea at all, would have used relatively coarse tea leaves steeped in hot water, producing a weak, slightly bitter beverage. The matcha used in tea ceremony is made from the finest young tea leaves, grown in shade to increase their chlorophyll content and reduce bitterness, then ground into an extremely fine powder. The resulting tea is thick, almost soup-like in consistency, with a rich, complex flavor that combines sweetness, bitterness, and umami in carefully balanced proportions. The vivid green color of properly prepared matcha is itself considered aesthetically significant, representing freshness, vitality, and the connection to nature. The preparation of matcha requires considerable skill and practice. The tea master must add exactly the right amount of powder to the bowl, typically about 2 scoops using the bamboo tea scoop. Then she adds hot water, but the temperature of the water must be precisely controlled. Water that's too hot will make the tea bitter and will destroy some of the delicate flavor compounds. Water that's too cool won't properly dissolve the powder and won't create the desired froth. The ideal temperature is around 70 to 80 degrees Celsius, hot enough to feel quite warm but not boiling. The tea master must judge this temperature by experience and intuition, as there are no thermometers in the tea house. Once the water is added, the whisking begins. The bamboo whisk is moved rapidly in a specific pattern, typically in a W or M shape, to break up any clumps of powder and to incorporate air into the mixture, creating the characteristic foam on the surface. The whisking must be vigorous enough to create proper froth, but not so violent that it splashes or creates uneven texture. It requires strong wrists and considerable practice to whisk properly. The sound of the whisk against the bowl, a rhythmic swishing, is itself considered part of the aesthetic experience of tea ceremony. When the tea is properly prepared, it should have a thick layer of fine bubbles on the surface, creating a creamy texture, and the taste should be smooth and rich without any grittiness from undissolved powder. As Hana drinks her portion of tea, she's aware of all these technical aspects, but she's also trying to simply experience and appreciate the tea itself. The flavor fills her mouth, slightly bitter, but also sweet and rich, with complex undertones that linger on the palate. The warmth of the bowl in her hands, the texture of the ceramic, the weight and balance of it, all of these sensations are part of the experience. She takes a moment to genuinely appreciate what she's tasting and feeling, before she allows her mind to return to the social dynamics of the gathering and her concern about how she's being perceived. The tea is accompanied by small sweets, carefully selected to complement the bitter tea and to provide a pleasant contrast of flavors. Today's sweets are delicate wagashi, traditional Japanese confections made from bean paste and rice flour, shaped and colored to represent autumn leaves. They're beautiful objects, almost too pretty to eat, and they taste subtly sweet without being cloying, the perfect accompaniment to the strong flavor of the matcha. The serving of these sweets follows its own protocol. They're presented on special plates or papers, and guests must take them with proper appreciation for their beauty and craftsmanship before consuming them. Between servings of tea, the conversation flows according to established patterns. Lady Takahaki comments on the flower arrangement in the alcove, a simple composition of autumn grasses and a single white chrysanthemum arranged in a rustic bamboo container. One of the ladies-in-waiting responds by quoting a classical poem about chrysanthemums, demonstrating her literary knowledge. Another woman comments on the hanging scroll, which shows a painting of a mountain landscape in mist, accompanied by calligraphy. The conversation is refined and aesthetically focused, avoiding any topics that might be controversial or emotionally charged. No one mentions politics, family conflicts, or personal problems. Everything is kept on the level of culture and beauty, creating a temporary world where only aesthetic values matter. Hana contributes to this conversation carefully, waiting for appropriate moments to speak, offering comments that demonstrate her education without seeming to show off. When there's a lull in the discussion, she mentions a poem she recently read that relates to the theme of autumn and impermanence. She recites a few lines from memory, and Lady Takahashi nods slightly in acknowledgement. It's a small success, a moment when Hana has added value to the gathering without overstepping any boundaries. These small successes accumulate over time, building her reputation and status within the household's social world. The ceremony continues. There are multiple servings of tea, each prepared with the same careful attention. Between servings, there's quiet conversation. The wife mentions the changing season, admiring the composition of the flower arrangement in the alcove. One of the ladies-in-waiting comments on the quality of the scroll painting. It's all very refined, very controlled, and underneath it all runs a current of tension and evaluation. Hana contributes to the conversation when appropriate, but she's careful never to speak unless spoken to first, and never to say anything that might be interpreted as putting herself forward. She offers one comment about the poem inscribed on the scroll, demonstrating her education without seeming to show off, and the wife acknowledges it with a small nod that might be approval or might be simple acknowledgement. It's impossible to tell. The ceremony lasts nearly 2 hours, and by the time it's finished, Hana's legs are numb and her back aches from holding the formal posture. But she maintains her composure as they file out of the tea house, offering appropriate thanks to the tea master and formal farewells to the wife and the other guests. Only when she's finally back in her own room, door closed, does she allow herself to relax. She sinks onto a cushion and massages her legs, trying to restore circulation. She's exhausted, and the day isn't even over yet. She still has to prepare for the possibility that she might be summoned to her lord's quarters this evening, which would require a whole new round of preparation and performance. But as the afternoon wears into evening, no summons comes. She eats her dinner in the common room with Yuki and Suzume, and they discuss the tea ceremony in low voices, analyzing every gesture and comment from the wife, trying to decode what it all meant. Yuki thinks the wife was in a relatively good mood, which might mean she's less likely to make trouble for them in the near future. Suzume is worried because she felt like the wife looked at her with particular coldness, though she can't think of anything she might have done to cause offense. Hana tries to be reassuring while also being realistic. The truth is, they can never really know what the wife is thinking or what might affect her attitude toward them. They're fundamentally at the mercy of her moods and decisions. After dinner, Hana returns to her room and prepares for bed. She removes her formal kimono and stores it carefully, changes into simple sleeping garments, and lets down her hair. She goes through her evening washing routine, then sits by the window for a few minutes, looking out at the darkened garden. There's a moon tonight, nearly full, and it casts everything in silver light. She can hear the sounds of the household settling for the night, voices calling good night in the distance, doors sliding closed, the rustle of wind in the trees. She thinks about the life she's living, trying to understand it, trying to find some meaning or purpose in it beyond simple survival. She thinks about the life she's living, trying to understand it, trying to find some meaning or purpose in it beyond simple survival. She's 22 years old, young by any measure, but she feels much older. She feels like she's lived several lifetimes already, like the girl she was before coming here belongs to a different existence entirely. She doesn't know what her future holds. If she's very fortunate, she might bear her lord a child, which would change her status significantly. A concubine who produces a child, especially a son, becomes much more secure in her position. But pregnancy is far from guaranteed, and even if it happens, childbirth is dangerous. Many women die bringing children into the world. Or her lord might lose interest in her entirely, and she might spend years living in this wing of the compound, growing older, becoming one of the senior women who manage the younger ones, living a life of increasing irrelevance. Or political fortunes might shift. The household might fall on hard times, and she might be dismissed, sent away to an uncertain fate. There are so many possibilities, and she has control over so few of them. What she does have control over is how she conducts herself in the present moment. She can be skilled and refined and careful. She can maintain her education and her appearance. She can navigate the social complexities of the household with grace and intelligence. These things won't guarantee her security or happiness, but they're the best tools she has. So she uses them day after day, performing the role she's been given as well as she possibly can, because what else is there to do? The alternative is to give up, to become bitter or careless, and that would only hasten her decline. She finally lies down on her futon, pulling the quilted covers over herself. She's tired, deeply tired, not just physically, but in some more fundamental way. But she'll wake up tomorrow morning and do it all again, because that's what her life is now. An endless succession of days, each one requiring the same careful performance, the same vigilance, the same careful management of herself and her relationships. It's exhausting, but it's also her reality, and she's learned to find small pleasures in it. The beauty of the garden, the satisfaction of a well-executed piece of calligraphy, the taste of good tea, the feeling of silk against her skin. These are the things that make the life bearable. As she drifts toward sleep, she finds herself thinking about a story she heard once, about a woman who lived 1,000 years ago, a concubine in the imperial court who became a famous poet. Her verses were preserved and anthologized, and she became immortal through her art. Hana wonders if she might do something similar, if her poems might outlive her. Probably not. She's not that talented, and her circumstances are not as exalted as those of the imperial court. But it's a pleasant fantasy, the idea that she might create something lasting, something that would prove she existed, and that her existence meant something. With that thought, she finally lets sleep take her, surrendering to the darkness and the quiet, knowing that tomorrow will bring more of the same, an endless cycle of ritual and performance and careful survival in a world that values her for what she can provide, but not for who she truly is. Now, let's step back and look at the broader context of concubinage in feudal Japan, because understanding Hana's individual experience requires understanding the system she's part of. Concubinage was a common practice among the elite classes during the feudal period, which we can roughly date from the 12th century through the mid-19th century, though of course social practices evolved considerably over that long span. The practice had several functions, some practical, some symbolic. On a practical level, concubines provided heirs and spares for the family line. In an era of high infant and maternal mortality, having children with multiple women increased the chances that at least some offspring would survive to adulthood. This was crucial for maintaining family lineages and ensuring continuity of power and property. But concubinage was also about displaying wealth and status. The ability to maintain multiple women in your household, to provide them with food, clothing, and living quarters that reflected aristocratic standards, was a form of conspicuous consumption. It demonstrated that you had resources to spare, that you were successful and powerful enough to afford luxuries. The concubines themselves became part of the household's prestige, especially if they were accomplished in arts like poetry, music, or calligraphy. When a lord entertained guests, he might call upon his concubines to perform, to serve tea, to provide elegant conversation. They were human status symbols, and their refinement reflected well on their lord's taste and discrimination. The legal and social status of concubines was complex and somewhat ambiguous. They were not wives, which meant they didn't have the legal protections and rights that came with marriage. The legitimate wife held a position that was protected by law and custom. She managed the household, controlled significant resources, and her children had clear inheritance rights. Concubines, by contrast, existed in a legal gray area. They had some protections, especially in well-managed households where there were clear rules about their treatment, but these protections were largely dependent on the benevolence and honor of their lord. If he chose to dismiss them, there was little they could do about it. If he died, their fate depended on the decisions of his heirs and his widow. The children of concubines occupied a similarly ambiguous position. They were recognized as the lord's offspring, which gave them certain advantages, but they typically had fewer inheritance rights than the children of the legitimate wife. In some cases, if the wife had no sons, a son born to a concubine might be elevated to the position of heir, but this usually required formal adoption and could create significant family conflict. Daughters of concubines had even more limited prospects. They might be married to minor retainers or allied families, but they wouldn't make the kind of advantageous matches available to the legitimate daughters. The daily life of concubines varied considerably depending on the household they served. In the greatest households, those of the shogun or major daimyo, concubines might live in considerable luxury, with personal servants, access to the finest clothing and cosmetics, and opportunities to participate in elaborate cultural activities. In smaller, less wealthy households, the conditions might be more modest, though still generally comfortable by the standards of the time. What was universal was the lack of freedom. Concubines could not leave the household without permission. They could not choose their occupations or their futures. They were, in effect, in a form of elegant imprisonment. The selection of concubines followed various patterns. Some were the daughters of retainers or minor samurai families, placed in the household through family arrangements. This was Hana's situation. Her family's connection to the lord's household, however tenuous, gave them the opportunity to place her there, and doing so served multiple purposes. It strengthened the bond between the families. It gave Hana a life of greater material comfort than her family could provide, and it potentially opened up future opportunities if she bore children or gained particular favor. Other concubines were purchased, either from their families or from intermediaries who specialized in identifying suitable women. Some came from the pleasure quarters, courtesans whose beauty or accomplishments caught the attention of a wealthy client who decided to remove them from that world and install them in his household. Each path came with its own complexities and implications. Training to become a concubine, when it was formalized, involved education in all the accomplishments expected of elite women. This meant literacy in Japanese and often some facility with Chinese characters, since Chinese learning was highly prestigious. It meant training in poetry composition, particularly in the short forms like waka and haiku. It meant musical instruction, usually in instruments like the koto or shamisen. It meant mastering tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and incense appreciation, the three great domestic arts. It also meant instruction in deportment, in how to move gracefully, how to speak properly, how to manage your facial expressions and body language. And, though this was rarely discussed openly, it meant some education in the arts of intimacy, though the extent and nature of this education varied considerably. The physical living conditions of concubines reflected their ambiguous status. They lived within the lord's compound, within the protected inner areas, which distinguished them from servants and indicated their privileged position. But their quarters were typically separate from the family's main living spaces, creating a physical manifestation of social distance. The architecture of elite compounds made these distinctions clear. There would be gates and corridors that marked boundaries between different social zones. Concubines could not simply wander through the compound at will. Their movements were regulated, monitored, and constrained. The relationship between concubines and the legitimate wife was one of the most delicate aspects of the system. A wife was often expected to accept the presence of other women in her household. Women who had close relationships with her husband, could have his children, and competed with her for resources and attention she believed were hers. Different wives handled this situation in different ways. Some adopted a stance of aloof dignity, simply ignoring the concubines as much as possible and focusing on their own duties and status. Others were actively hostile, using their power to make the concubines' lives difficult through petty humiliations and resource restrictions. Some, more rarely, developed relationships of mutual respect or even guarded friendship with at least some of the concubines, recognizing their shared subordination to the same man and the same system. But even in the best circumstances, there was always an undercurrent of competition and resentment. The concubines themselves had to navigate not only their relationships with the wife and the lord, but also their relationships with each other. They were competing for limited resources, the lord's attention, his favor, material benefits, and the security that came with bearing children. This created natural tensions. At the same time, they shared a common situation that no one else in the household truly understood. They were all performing the same difficult balancing act, all subject to the same anxieties and vulnerabilities. This could create bonds of solidarity, at least in some cases. Women who had been in the household for many years might develop genuine friendships or at least working relationships based on mutual support and shared information. New arrivals were particularly vulnerable, knowing nothing about the specific customs and personalities of the household, and they often depended on the kindness or at least the guidance of more senior concubines to learn how to survive. The social world of concubines extended beyond just their relationships with other women in the household. They also had to manage relationships with servants, with the lord's retainers and advisors, and with visiting dignitaries. Each relationship had its own protocols and potential pitfalls. Servants might resent concubines, seeing them as privileged and lazy, living in luxury while the servants did all the actual work. Or servants might be deferential and helpful, recognizing that concubines had the Lord's ear and could potentially help or harm them through a word spoken at the right moment. The key was to be gracious without being familiar, to maintain the dignity of your position without being arrogant about it. Retainers and advisors presented a different challenge. These were men of significant status within the household hierarchy, and concubines had to be extremely careful in their interactions with them. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion of inappropriate familiarity could be devastating to a concubine's reputation. The ideal was to be invisible to these men, except in formal settings where your role was clearly defined, such as serving tea at a gathering or performing music for entertainment. Even then, you kept your eyes lowered, your manner modest, and your interactions brief and formal. The slightest misstep could lead to gossip and scandal that would destroy your position. Visiting dignitaries were yet another complication. When important guests came to the household, concubines might be called upon to help entertain them, particularly if the guests were themselves men of high status who would expect refinement and culture. This was both an opportunity and a danger. It was an opportunity to demonstrate your value, to show that you were an asset to the household, someone whose accomplishments reflected well on your lord. But it was also dangerous because you were being displayed to outsiders whose reactions you couldn't predict and whose standards might be different from what you were accustomed to. You had to be perfectly poised, demonstrating your skills without seeming to show off, being engaging without being forward, navigating the complex social dynamics of a gathering where everyone was performing roles and evaluating everyone else. The intimate aspects of a concubine's relationship with her lord were, of course, central to her role, but they were also the least discussed openly. There was a discretion, almost a silence, around these matters in public conversation. What happened in the lord's private quarters stayed private, at least officially. In reality, of course, everyone in the household knew, or thought they knew, what was going on. The servants who prepared the rooms, the guards who monitored the corridors, the other concubines who noticed when someone was summoned and when she returned, all of these people formed a network of observation and gossip. But the official stance was discretion and privacy. The actual nature of these intimate relationships varied tremendously depending on the personalities involved. Some lords were relatively considerate, treating their concubines with respect and even affection. Others were demanding or rough, treating the encounters as simply a satisfaction of physical needs with little regard for the woman's experience. Some lords wanted conversation and companionship as much as physical intimacy. They might summon a concubine to their quarters and spend hours talking about poetry or politics, seeking her opinion, enjoying her company. Others wanted only the physical aspect and had no interest in conversation. A concubine had to adapt to whatever her lord wanted, to be whatever he needed her to be in any given moment. The physical spaces where these encounters occurred were designed with careful attention to aesthetics and comfort. The lord's private quarters were typically the finest rooms in the compound, with the best views of the gardens, the highest quality tatami mats, the most beautiful art objects and furnishings. There would be screens decorated with paintings or calligraphy, shelves holding books and curiosities, cabinets containing clothing and personal items. The sleeping area would have thick, luxurious futons with fine silk covers, and there might be subtle incense burning to create a pleasant atmosphere. Everything was arranged to create an environment of refined sensuality, where physical pleasure was elevated by aesthetic sophistication. When a concubine was summoned to these quarters, she would arrive having prepared herself carefully. She would have bathed and perfumed herself, arranged her hair beautifully, dressed in an attractive but not overly formal kimono. She might bring a small gift, perhaps some sweets or a piece of her own calligraphy, as a gesture of respect and affection. Upon arriving, she would greet the lord with appropriate formality, then allow him to set the tone for the encounter. If he wanted to talk, she would be an engaging conversationalist. If he wanted music, she might play the koto or sing. If he wanted intimacy, she would be responsive and accommodating. The emotional dimensions of these encounters were complex and varied. Some concubines developed genuine affection for their lords, finding in him qualities they admired or appreciated. The relationship might become something resembling partnership, with real emotional connection and mutual caring. Other concubines felt little beyond the obligation to perform their role, going through the motions without emotional investment. Some experienced the encounters as pleasant, others as neutral, still others as actively unpleasant. But regardless of their personal feelings, they were expected to appear willing and responsive, to make the lord feel desired and appreciated. The performance of enthusiasm and pleasure was part of the job, even when it didn't reflect inner reality. There were also practical considerations and concerns that shaped these intimate relationships. Concubines had to be attentive to their own health and fertility, aware of the signs that might indicate pregnancy or illness. They had access to various folk remedies and medical knowledge passed down through networks of women about how to prevent or encourage pregnancy, how to manage menstruation, how to deal with various women's health issues. Some of this knowledge was reasonably effective, based on centuries of observation and experimentation. Other remedies were based on superstition and did little or nothing. But concubines relied on whatever knowledge they could access because their bodies and their health were fundamental to their position and prospects. The question of pregnancy was always present, shaping how concubines thought about and experienced intimate encounters. Pregnancy could dramatically improve a concubine's status and security, particularly if she bore a son. But it also carried enormous risks. Maternal mortality was high, and many women died in childbirth or from complications following it. Even successful pregnancies could leave women with lasting health problems. And there was always the possibility of miscarriage or stillbirth, which could be devastating both emotionally and practically. A concubine who lost a pregnancy might be blamed or seen as unlucky, might lose favor and status. So the desire for pregnancy was always tempered by fear and awareness of risks. Some concubines used various methods to try to control their fertility, attempting to prevent pregnancy when they felt it wasn't the right time or when they were concerned about their health. The methods available were crude by modern standards, but they existed. Women shared knowledge about certain herbs that were believed to prevent conception or to terminate early pregnancy. They tracked their menstrual cycles and tried to avoid intimate encounters during what they understood to be fertile periods, though their knowledge of reproductive biology was limited and often incorrect. They used physical barriers or douches made from various substances. None of these methods were particularly reliable, but they represented attempts to exert some control over a fundamental aspect of their lives. The afterthought of intimate encounters also followed certain patterns. A concubine would typically spend the night in the lord's quarters, sleeping beside him or in an adjacent room. In the morning, she would wake early, before the lord or with him, and would help him prepare for the day if he wished, or she would quietly withdraw to let him ready himself in private. She would return to her own quarters carrying whatever small gifts or tokens he might have given her, and she would resume her normal routine. But the experience of having been summoned, of having spent time in the Lord's presence, would subtly affect her status and how others in the household treated her. She would be seen as currently in favor, which would make servants more attentive, might make other concubines more envious or more deferential, and would generally improve her position in the household's complex social calculus. Pregnancy was always a possibility and a complication. If a concubine became pregnant, it changed her status significantly, at least temporarily. A pregnant concubine required special care and attention. She was valuable now as the carrier of a potential heir, and her health and well-being became matters of concern for the entire household. She would be monitored by midwives and doctors. Her diet would be supervised, and she would be excused from many of her usual duties. This elevated attention could be pleasant, but it also came with tremendous pressure. Miscarriage was common, and a concubine who lost a child might be blamed, might be seen as having failed in her most important function. And childbirth itself was dangerous. Many women died in childbirth, and even successful births often left women weakened or injured. If a concubine successfully bore a child who survived, particularly a son, her position became much more secure. Once she became the mother of her lord's child, her position in the household gained a deeper significance, creating a bond that went beyond ordinary attraction. She could expect continued support and maintenance, and she would have a role in raising the child, at least during the early years. But even this came with complications. The child might be taken from her and raised primarily by nurses and tutors, with her role reduced to occasional visits. If the child was a son, he would eventually be incorporated into the samurai class, given duties and responsibilities, and his connection to his birth mother might become tenuous or even embarrassing, a reminder of his less than fully legitimate status. Daughters born to concubines faced different challenges. They had limited marriage prospects compared to legitimate daughters, and their futures often depended on their father's willingness to provide dowries and make arrangements for them. Some concubines' daughters were married to minor retainers or allied families of lower status. Others might end up becoming concubines themselves, continuing the cycle in a different household. A very few, if they were exceptionally beautiful or talented, might make surprisingly good matches, but this was rare and usually required considerable political maneuvering by their mothers. The aging of concubines was a source of considerable anxiety. A concubine's value was largely based on her youth and beauty, and as she aged, both of these commodities diminished. A woman in her 30s might still be attractive and accomplished, but she was competing against younger women, and in most cases, youth won. As concubines aged, they faced a gradual marginalization within the household. They might be summoned less frequently, then hardly at all. Their material support might be reduced. They might be moved to less desirable quarters. In the worst cases, they might be dismissed entirely, sent away to live with relatives or in a temple, their years of service rewarded with a small stipend and a retirement into obscurity. The process of aging affected concubines not just physically, but psychologically. The loss of beauty and youth, which had been central to their identity and value, could be devastating. Looking in the mirror and seeing the first signs of aging, the fine lines around the eyes, the slight loosening of the skin, the gray hairs appearing at the temples, these observations could trigger anxiety and depression. Each birthday became a reminder of time passing, of opportunities closing, of the inevitability of decline. The arrival of new, younger concubines in the household was particularly painful, as it made clear that you were being replaced, that your time of favor was ending. Different women responded to aging in different ways. Some fought against it desperately, spending increasing amounts of time and effort on their appearance, using makeup to hide wrinkles, dyeing their hair to cover gray, maintaining strict discipline about diet and exercise. They became obsessed with preserving what remained of their youthful appearance, knowing that their entire position depended on it. Others accepted aging with more resignation, even relief. They let go of the constant effort to be beautiful and desirable, finding a kind of freedom in no longer being the focus of that particular kind of attention. They transitioned into other roles, becoming advisors and managers, teachers and mentors, finding new sources of value and identity. The household's treatment of aging concubines varied considerably depending on the lord's character and the household's resources. In generous, well-managed households, women who had served loyally for many years could expect to be maintained comfortably even after their active service ended. They might be given administrative roles, teaching positions, or simply allowed to live quietly in their quarters with adequate support. In less generous or more financially pressed households, aging concubines might be dismissed with minimal support, forced to rely on whatever savings they had accumulated or whatever family connections they could activate. The fear of ending up destitute in old age haunted many concubines throughout their tenure. Some aging concubines formed what might be called retirement plans, carefully cultivating relationships with temples or with their birth families, setting aside money when possible, developing skills that might provide them with alternative sources of income or support. They might learn herbal medicine and become healers, or they might develop their calligraphy to the point where they could make money as scribes or teachers. They might arrange marriages for themselves with men willing to take older wives, trading their remaining beauty and their elite cultural training for security and respectability. All of these strategies required foresight, planning, and often considerable luck. The relationship between aging concubines and younger concubines was complex and often difficult. The younger women represented everything the older women had lost or were losing: youth, beauty, the Lord's favor, a sense of unlimited possibilities. It would be natural for older concubines to resent the younger ones, to see them as threats and competitors. And indeed, some older concubines were bitter and hostile, making life difficult for their younger counterparts out of jealousy and frustration. But others took a more generous approach, recognizing that the younger women were not personally responsible for the situation and that they would someday face the same challenges. These older concubines became mentors and guides, sharing hard-won wisdom about how to navigate the household's complexities, offering advice and support, creating continuity across generations. The mentoring relationship between older and younger concubines could be deeply meaningful for both parties. For the younger woman, having an experienced guide who understood her situation and could offer practical advice was invaluable. She could learn from the older woman's mistakes and successes, could get insight into the personalities and preferences of key household members, could receive emotional support during difficult times. For the older woman, the mentoring relationship provided a new sense of purpose and value. She was no longer just aging and declining. She was passing on knowledge, helping shape the next generation, creating a legacy that would outlast her active service. This could make the process of aging less bitter and more meaningful. The physical effects of aging were more severe in feudal Japan than they might be in modern times, due to the limited medical care available and the generally harsh conditions of life. Dental problems were common and often severe, as there was little understanding of oral hygiene and no effective dental care. Many people lost teeth by their 30s or 40s, which affected their ability to eat, their appearance, and their overall health. Concubines might have somewhat better dental care than commoners, as they had access to rudimentary tooth cleaning methods and could afford softer, higher-quality foods. But dental decline was still inevitable for most people. Vision problems also became common with age, and there was little that could be done about them. Eyeglasses existed, but were rare and expensive, imported from China or Europe, and were not widely available. Concubines who developed vision problems might find it increasingly difficult to read, to do fine needlework, to perform calligraphy, all activities that had been central to their lives and their value. This loss of ability to engage in activities they loved could be deeply frustrating and depressing. Joint pain and arthritis were also common as people aged, particularly in a damp climate like Japan's. The practice of sitting on the floor for long periods, which was required by formal etiquette, could be particularly hard on knees and hips. Aging concubines might experience increasing pain and stiffness, making it difficult to maintain the graceful movements and postures that were expected of them. They might need to request accommodations, such as cushions or permission to change positions more frequently, which could be embarrassing and which marked them as old and declining. The psychological challenges of aging included not just the loss of youth and beauty, but also the awareness of mortality. As concubines entered their 40s and 50s, they began to experience the deaths of people they had known, both in the household and in the wider world. Fellow concubines might die in childbirth or from disease. Servants and retainers would pass away. The Lord himself might die, throwing everything into uncertainty. These deaths served as reminders that life was temporary, that everyone's time was limited, that the carefully constructed world of the household could collapse at any moment. This awareness could lead to various responses, from increased religiosity and focus on spiritual matters to a kind of fatalism or depression. Some aging concubines turned increasingly to religious practice as a way of finding meaning and preparing for death. They might spend more time at the household shrine, might study Buddhist texts more seriously, might engage in meditation and other spiritual practices. Religion offered a framework for understanding aging and death that could make these experiences less frightening. The Buddhist teachings about impermanence, suffering, and the cycle of rebirth provided a philosophical context that could help women accept what was happening to them. The idea that this life was just one moment in an endless series of lives, that physical decline was inevitable and ultimately unimportant compared to spiritual development, these concepts could be comforting and empowering. Other aging concubines responded to their changing circumstances by becoming more involved in household management and politics. As they lost their role as sexual partners, they might gain influence in other ways, becoming advisors, mediators, or administrators. They had accumulated years of experience and knowledge about how the household worked, who had power and influence, what strategies were effective in various situations. This knowledge was valuable, and shrewd older concubines could leverage it to maintain and even increase their status within the household. They might become confidants to the Lord's wife, helping her manage the younger concubines. They might take on responsibility for training new arrivals or managing the household's cultural activities. They might become involved in arranging marriages or other important household decisions. The economic situation of aging concubines was always precarious. Unless they had born children who could support them, or unless they had managed to accumulate significant savings, they depended entirely on the household's continued willingness to maintain them. This dependence was a source of ongoing anxiety. What if the household's fortunes declined? What if the Lord died and his heir decided to reduce expenses by dismissing older retainers and dependents? What if the Lord's wife, who might have resented the concubines for decades, finally had the power to get rid of them? All of these scenarios were possible, and aging concubines lived with the awareness that their security could vanish at any moment. Some concubines, however, managed to transition into different roles within the household. A woman who had borne children might be retained to help raise them. A woman with particular skills in household management might be given administrative responsibilities, overseeing younger concubines or managing certain aspects of the compound. These transitions required intelligence and adaptability, the ability to reinvent yourself and find new sources of value when the old ones faded. The women who succeeded in this were often the ones who had been building relationships and acquiring skills throughout their tenure, not just relying on beauty and sexual attraction, but cultivating a broader base of competence and usefulness. The psychological and emotional experience of being a concubine is difficult to fully capture, particularly from our modern perspective. These women lived in a world with very different assumptions about individuality, autonomy, and personal fulfillment. The idea that you should be able to choose your own life path, that your happiness and self-realization should be primary considerations, these are relatively modern concepts. In feudal Japan, the emphasis was on duty, on fulfilling your role within the social order, on maintaining harmony and propriety. Personal desires were secondary to social obligations. This doesn't mean people didn't have desires or feelings, of course. Of course they did. But the framework for understanding and expressing those feelings was different. Many concubines probably experienced their situation with a kind of resigned acceptance. This was the hand they had been dealt, the role they had been assigned, and they did their best to play it well. They found satisfaction where they could, in mastering a skill, in creating something beautiful, in the small pleasures of daily life. They formed relationships with other women in similar situations, creating networks of support and understanding. They might develop genuine affection for their lord, or at least a working relationship of mutual respect. They might take pride in their children and find purpose in motherhood, limited as their maternal role might be. But it would be naive to assume that all or even most concubines were content with their situation. Many must have felt frustrated by the constraints on their lives, resentful of their dependence and vulnerability, angry at the unfairness of a system that gave them so little control over their own fates. Some must have grieved for the lives they might have had, the choices they were never allowed to make. The historical record preserves some evidence of this discontent. There are poems by concubines that speak of loneliness, of longing for freedom, of the pain of separation from family, of the bitter awareness of aging and declining favor. There are stories of concubines who rebelled in various ways, who spoke too freely, who refused to perform their roles adequately, who had to be punished or removed. These were the exceptions, the women who couldn't or wouldn't adapt to the system, but their existence reminds us that not everyone accepted their fate gracefully. Let's return now to Hana and follow her through another day, this one different from the first, to give you a fuller sense of the variety of experiences that made up a concubine's life. It's been about 2 weeks since the day we first observed, and the weather has turned colder. The autumn is progressing toward winter, and the household is making preparations for the colder months ahead. The gardens are being winterized, with delicate plants wrapped in protective coverings and paths cleared of fallen leaves. Inside the compound, servants are checking the paper screens for tears that might let in cold drafts, and they're bringing out heavier bedding and warmer clothing. Hana wakes this morning with a sense of anticipation mixed with nervousness. Yesterday evening, she received a message that her lord wishes to see her today. Not for an intimate encounter, the message specified, but for conversation and music. He's hosting a small gathering of close advisors in the evening, and he wants her to provide entertainment, to play the koto, and perhaps share some poetry. This is both an honor and a test. It's an honor because it means he values her accomplishments enough to display them to important guests. It's a test because her performance will be observed and judged not just by her lord, but by these other men, and their opinions could influence her status in the household. She spends extra time on her appearance this morning, selecting a kimono of deep purple silk decorated with a pattern of plum blossoms, which are associated with early spring and with resilience, since plum trees bloom even in cold weather. It's a subtle message of strength and refinement. She arranges her hair in an elaborate style that requires nearly an hour to complete, using multiple pins and ornaments. She applies her makeup with particular care, aiming for a look that's striking without being theatrical. When she finally examines herself in the mirror, she's satisfied with the result. She looks elegant, accomplished, beautiful in a way that suggests natural grace rather than obvious effort, even though the effort has been considerable. After breakfast, she spends several hours practicing on the koto. Her instrument is kept in a storage room shared by all the concubines, and she has to reserve time to use it. She's fortunate that no one else wanted it this morning. She settles in a room with good acoustics and spreads the koto before her on the floor. It's a beautiful instrument, about 6 feet long, made of paulownia wood with 13 strings stretched across movable bridges. She tunes it carefully, adjusting each bridge until the tones are perfect, then begins practicing the pieces she plans to perform this evening. She's selected 3 pieces, each chosen for a specific effect. The first is a classical composition, something ancient and well-known that demonstrates her mastery of traditional technique. The second is a more recent piece, more emotional and expressive, that shows her ability to convey feeling through music. The third is a folk song that's been arranged for koto, something lighter and more accessible that should provide a pleasant conclusion to her performance. She plays through each piece multiple times, working on difficult passages, making sure her fingering is clean and her dynamics are appropriate. Music requires complete concentration, a focusing of mind and body that Hana finds deeply satisfying. When she's playing well, she forgets about everything else, all the anxieties and calculations that usually occupy her thoughts. There's only the music, the vibration of strings, the flow of melody and rhythm. By early afternoon, she's as prepared as she can be. She puts the koto away carefully and returns to her room to rest and to mentally rehearse what she might say if conversation is required. Her lord's advisors are serious men, samurai and administrators who deal with matters of governance and warfare. They won't want empty pleasantries. If she's called upon to speak, she needs to say something intelligent and interesting without being opinionated or forward. It's a delicate balance, one that requires her to be engaging while remaining properly subordinate. The evening comes, and she receives the summons. A servant appears to escort her to the Lord's private reception room, carrying her koto for her, since it's too large and valuable for her to transport alone. As she walks through the corridors toward the main part of the compound, she breathes deeply, steadying her nerves. She's done this before. She's skilled and prepared. She can do it well. But the nervousness doesn't entirely disappear. There's too much at stake, Too many ways this could go wrong. The reception room is more spacious than her lord's private quarters, with room for a small group to sit comfortably. When she arrives, her lord is already there with 3 of his advisors. They're seated around a low table with sake cups and dishes of appetizers. The atmosphere is relaxed, the conversation easy, but it becomes more formal when she enters. She bows deeply, offering the proper greeting, and her lord acknowledges her, gesturing for her to take her place near the alcove where she'll perform. The servant helps her position the koto, then withdraws, leaving her alone with the 4 men. For a moment, she feels intensely self-conscious, aware of being the only woman in the room, aware of the scrutiny she's under. But then her training takes over. She bows again, announcing that she will now perform, and then she begins to play. Her fingers move across the strings, producing the familiar patterns of the first piece, and gradually her self-consciousness fades. She's no longer Hana, the nervous concubine. She's a musician, and the music is flowing through her, and that's all that matters in this moment. The first piece ends, and there's a moment of silence, then appreciation from the men. Her lord looks pleased, and one of the advisors, an older man with gray in his hair, compliments her technique. She bows in acknowledgement, then begins the second piece. This one is more emotional, more challenging, and she pours herself into it, letting the music express things she could never say in words, feelings of longing and melancholy and beauty that are too complex for simple language. When it ends, she can feel that something has shifted in the room. The men are more engaged, more moved. Even the youngest advisor, who had seemed rather bored during the first piece, is now paying attention. The third piece provides a lighter conclusion, and by the time she finishes, the atmosphere in the room is warm and appreciative. Her lord is clearly pleased with her performance, and this pleasure extends to the entire gathering. The advisors compliment her, and one of them asks her about her training, where she learned to play so well. She answers modestly, crediting her teacher and her family's appreciation for the arts, deflecting the praise while accepting it gracefully. Her lord then asks if she knows any poetry by a particular classical Chinese poet, one of his favorites, and she does. She recites several verses from memory, and this leads to a broader conversation about poetry and literature, in which she participates carefully, offering opinions when asked, but never dominating the discussion. The evening stretches on for several hours, and by the time she's finally dismissed, she's exhausted but satisfied. She knows she performed well, that she enhanced rather than detracted from the gathering, that she demonstrated her value. As she makes her way back to her quarters, the koto once again being carried by a servant, she allows herself a moment of pride. She did what was required of her, and she did it well. Tomorrow, there will be new challenges, new anxieties, but tonight she can rest knowing that she succeeded. Back in her room, she undresses carefully, storing her formal kimono, removing the ornaments from her hair. She washes her face, removing the makeup, and looks at herself in the mirror. Without the elaborate presentation, she sees the real person underneath, and she's struck by how young she still looks, despite feeling so much older. 22 years old. She's lived nearly a quarter of her life in this household, performing this role. How much longer will it continue? Will she still be here in 10 years? In 20? Will she bear children? Will she grow old in this compound, gradually fading into the background? Or will something change, some shift in fortune or circumstance that takes her life in a direction she can't currently imagine? These questions have no answers, at least not yet, so she sets them aside and prepares for bed. But before she sleeps, she takes out her writing materials and composes a poem about the evening, about the music and the autumn night and the strange life she's living. The poem isn't particularly good, she can tell even as she writes it, but the act of composition is satisfying. It's something she's creating for herself, a small act of self-expression in a life where so much is performed for others. She reads it over once, makes a small correction, then folds the paper and tucks it away with other writings she's accumulated over the years. Maybe someday someone will read these poems and get a glimpse of who she really was, what she really felt. Or maybe they'll be burned or thrown away when she dies, forgotten like most lives are forgotten. But for now, they exist, and that's enough. The rhythm of concubine life involved not just daily routines, but also seasonal cycles and special occasions. The changing seasons were marked by specific festivals and observances, and concubines participated in these according to their status in the household. The New Year's celebrations were particularly elaborate, involving days of preparation and ritual. Concubines would receive new clothing appropriate to the season, and they would participate in various ceremonial activities. They might help prepare special foods, arrange flowers for the household altars, or assist with entertaining guests who came to offer New Year greetings to the Lord and his family. The spring brought its own festivals, particularly celebrations related to cherry blossom viewing. In households wealthy enough to have extensive gardens, there might be elaborate parties where guests gathered to appreciate the cherry blossoms, to compose poetry inspired by the flowers, to eat and drink while surrounded by fleeting beauty. Concubines might be called upon to provide music or to serve food and drink to add to the aesthetic atmosphere of the gathering. These events were opportunities to demonstrate refinement and grace, but they were also exhausting, requiring long hours of performance and careful attention to propriety. Summer was often quieter, a time when the oppressive heat made elaborate activities less appealing. The household rhythm slowed during the hottest months, and concubines might have more time for their own pursuits. This was when Hana often focused on her calligraphy and poetry, using the relative quiet to improve her skills. She might spend hot afternoons in the garden, fanning herself and watching the insects and birds, observing the natural world that continued its cycles regardless of human social dramas. Autumn brought harvest festivals and preparations for winter. The household's food stores would be replenished, and there was a general sense of urgency about getting ready for the cold months ahead. Concubines might be involved in checking winter clothing, making sure everything was clean and repaired, preparing braziers and heating supplies. And there were cultural events too, moon viewing parties where people gathered to appreciate the full moon of autumn, writing poems and sharing sake while contemplating the beauty and melancholy of the season. Winter was often the most challenging season. The compounds were not well heated by modern standards, and the cold could be penetrating, especially at night. Concubines would bundle in multiple layers of clothing and huddle near small braziers for warmth. The long winter evenings were sometimes lonely, as travel was more difficult and there were fewer visitors and entertainments. But winter also had its own beauty, particularly when snow transformed the gardens into scenes of stark elegance, and there were winter festivals to break up the monotony, particularly those around the New Year. Beyond the seasonal cycles, there were also life cycle events that affected concubines. Births, deaths, marriages, and coming-of-age ceremonies for the Lord's children all created shifts in the household dynamics. When a child was born to the legitimate wife, there would be elaborate celebrations, and concubines would be expected to participate appropriately, offering congratulations and gifts while maintaining awareness of their subordinate status. When a child of the Lord reached adulthood, there might be ceremonies and festivities, and again, concubines might have roles to play in these events. Deaths were particularly complex, as they could dramatically reshape the household power structure. The death of the Lord was the most significant event, throwing everything into uncertainty as his heirs and widow decided the future of the household and everyone in it. Religious and spiritual practices were woven throughout concubine life. Buddhism and Shinto coexisted in feudal Japan, and most households maintained observances related to both traditions. There would be Buddhist altars and Shinto shrines within the compound, and concubines were expected to participate in prayers and offerings. Some concubines became genuinely devout, finding in religious practice a source of comfort and meaning that their secular lives didn't provide. Others went through the motions, performing the required rituals without deep personal investment. Religion offered certain consolations. The Buddhist emphasis on impermanence and suffering could provide a framework for understanding a difficult life. The idea that this existence was temporary, that it was just one moment in a vast cycle of death and rebirth, might make present difficulties more bearable. And there was always the possibility, however remote, that a concubine might retire to a temple in her old age, living out her final years in contemplation and study. The economic aspects of concubinage were rarely discussed openly, but were fundamental to the system. Maintaining concubines was expensive. They required food, clothing, housing, and various material goods. They might need medical care, cosmetics, musical instruments, writing materials, and countless other items. The household had to provide all of this, and it represented a significant ongoing expense. This economic reality meant that only wealthy households could afford to maintain multiple concubines, and the number of concubines a household could support was directly related to its economic resources. During times of financial difficulty, concubines might be dismissed or their material support might be reduced. This created a direct link between the household's economic fortunes and the concubine's welfare, making them vulnerable to economic changes beyond their control. Some concubines received stipends or allowances, small amounts of money they could use for personal expenses. The size of these stipends varied based on the household's wealth and the concubine's status within it. A favored concubine, or one who had borne children, might receive a generous allowance. Others might receive very little or nothing at all, being entirely dependent on what the household provided directly. These stipends, when they existed, provided a small measure of autonomy.
A concubine could use her allowance to purchase small luxuries, gifts for other household members, or supplies for her artistic pursuits.
She might save money over time, creating a small reserve that could provide security or options in an uncertain future. But the amounts were generally small, nothing like enough to provide real independence or alternative options. The educational activities that concubines engaged in were not just about personal enrichment or entertainment for the lord. They were also about maintaining market value and status within the household. A concubine who let her skills atrophy, who stopped studying and practicing, would gradually become less valuable. Her performances would become less impressive, her conversation less interesting, and she would face increasing competition from younger women who were actively developing their abilities. So, education was ongoing, a constant effort to maintain and improve. This might involve formal lessons with teachers brought into the household, or it might be self-directed study using books and materials from the household's library. Some concubines specialized in particular arts, becoming known for exceptional skill in poetry or music or calligraphy. This specialization could provide a unique value proposition, making them less easily replaceable. The household library, when one existed, was a valuable resource that concubines with sufficient literacy could access. Elite households often maintained collections of books, though these were expensive and relatively rare items in an era before mass printing. The books would include classical Chinese texts, Japanese poetry anthologies, Buddhist sutras, histories, and various other works of literature and learning. Access to these books was typically controlled, with certain texts considered inappropriate for women or restricted to scholars and officials. But concubines who demonstrated serious interest in learning might be granted permission to read and study from the library under appropriate supervision. The act of reading in feudal Japan was quite different from modern reading experiences. Books were handwritten or printed from wooden blocks, making each volume a valuable object requiring careful handling. The text was typically written in classical Chinese or in Japanese, using a mixture of Chinese characters and Japanese phonetic scripts. Reading required not just basic literacy, but considerable education, as classical Chinese was a foreign language even to educated Japanese, requiring years of study to master. Many texts included commentaries and annotations that helped readers understand the meaning and significance of passages, and these commentaries themselves required interpretation. When Hana reads from the household library, she typically chooses poetry anthologies or collections of essays by famous writers. She's drawn to works that explore themes of impermanence, beauty, and the passage of time, themes that resonate with her own experience. She reads slowly, sometimes spending an hour on a single page, working through the classical Chinese with the help of annotations, thinking deeply about the meaning and implications of what she's reading. This kind of deep, meditative reading is a form of intellectual and spiritual practice, not just entertainment or information gathering. It's a way of engaging with the greatest minds of the past, of entering into conversation with poets and philosophers who lived centuries ago, but whose insights remain relevant and meaningful. Hana also writes her own poetry, though she knows her work cannot compare with the masterpieces in the anthology. Poetry composition is expected of educated women in her position, and she's been practicing it since her childhood. The form she most often uses is the waka, a 31-syllable poem arranged in 5 lines with a pattern of 5, 7, 5, 7, and 7 syllables. This form has been used in Japanese poetry for over 1,000 years, and countless poets have explored its possibilities and limitations. The challenge of the waka is to express complex thoughts and emotions within its tight constraints, to create images and associations that resonate beyond the literal meaning of the words. Hana's poems typically address conventional themes like the changing seasons, the beauty of nature, the sadness of separation, and the transience of life. These are the themes that are considered appropriate for women's poetry, and she works within these conventions while trying to find something genuine and personal to express. A poem she wrote recently describes autumn leaves falling into a stream, carried away by the current, and she intends it as a meditation on how individual lives are swept along by forces beyond their control, beautiful for a moment and then gone. Whether anyone reading the poem would understand this intended meaning is uncertain, as waka are typically quite ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. But the act of composition itself is satisfying, a way of processing her experiences and emotions through artistic form. Poetry composition also serves social functions in the household. Concubines and ladies-in-waiting sometimes engage in poetry exchanges, where one person composes a poem and another responds with a poem on the same theme or using similar imagery. These exchanges demonstrate wit, education, and creativity, and they create social bonds between the participants. A particularly good poem might be shared more widely, earning its composer a reputation for refinement and talent. Poetry might also be composed to mark special occasions, to express gratitude or congratulation, to offer comfort in times of difficulty. These occasional poems serve specific social purposes while also allowing for artistic expression. The relationship between poetry and painting in Japanese aesthetics is also worth noting. Many poems are inspired by or respond to paintings, and many paintings include calligraphic inscriptions of poems. The combination of visual and verbal art creates a unified aesthetic experience that's greater than either element alone. Hana sometimes looks at paintings in the household's collection and composes poems inspired by them, trying to capture in words the feeling or impression created by the visual image. This practice connects her to a long tradition of scholar artists who moved fluidly between different artistic media, seeing them all as expressions of a unified aesthetic sensibility. Music is another art form that occupies significant time and attention in Hana's life. She plays the koto, a long zither with 13 strings, and she's developed considerable skill over her years in the household. The koto is considered one of the most refined instruments, appropriate for elite women, and its repertoire includes both ancient court music and more recent compositions. Learning to play the koto requires years of practice, as the technique involves complex fingering patterns and the ability to produce subtle variations in tone and timbre. The instrument is played by plucking the strings with picks worn on the fingers, and players must learn to control the pressure and angle of the picks to produce the desired sound. The music played on the koto ranges from slow, meditative pieces that evoke natural scenes or seasonal moods, to faster, more technically demanding compositions that showcase the player's virtuosity. Some pieces include singing, with the instrumentalist also performing the vocal part, which requires coordination between playing and singing and the ability to maintain proper pitch and timing. Hana's practice sessions involve working through pieces she already knows, maintaining her technique, and keeping the music fresh, as well as learning new pieces that expand her repertoire and challenge her skills. The aesthetic principles that govern koto performance emphasize subtlety and suggestion rather than obvious display. A good performance should seem effortless, with the technical difficulties hidden beneath a surface of natural grace. The sound should be clear and pure, with each note properly resonating and fading. The performer should appear absorbed in the music, not self-conscious or obviously performing for an audience. These ideals are difficult to achieve, requiring not just technical skill, but a kind of inner calm and focus that allows the music to flow through you rather than being forced or manufactured. When Hana performs for her lord or for guests, she experiences a complex mixture of feelings. There's the nervousness of being evaluated, the desire to perform well and to receive appreciation and approval. But there's also the genuine pleasure of making music, of losing herself in the sound and the rhythm, of creating something beautiful. In her best performances, the nervousness fades, and she enters a state of complete absorption, where self-consciousness disappears and only the music remains. These moments are transcendent, brief glimpses of what it might feel like to be truly free, unbound by the constant awareness of being observed and judged. The psychological impact of living in constant competition with other women should not be underestimated. Every concubine knew that she was competing with the others for limited resources, attention, and favor. This competition could poison relationships, creating atmospheres of suspicion and resentment. Women who might otherwise have been friends instead became rivals, always watching each other, always comparing themselves, always looking for advantages or weaknesses. This competitive pressure was exhausting and corrosive, eating away at possibilities for genuine connection and solidarity. Some women managed to resist this pressure, forming real friendships despite the competitive structure. But they were probably the exception rather than the rule. There were also hierarchies among the concubines themselves. A woman who had been in the household longer had seniority and generally commanded more respect. A woman who had borne children, especially sons, had higher status than those who had not. A woman who had borne children, especially sons, had higher status than those who had not. A woman who was currently in favor with the Lord had informal power that others lacked. These hierarchies were fluid and could shift based on changing circumstances, but they were always present, always influencing interactions and relationships. Junior concubines were expected to defer to senior ones, to speak respectfully, to yield in matters of precedence. Senior concubines might mentor junior ones, offering advice and guidance, or they might be cold and dismissive, seeing the younger women as threats rather than colleagues. The physical health of concubines was generally better than that of most people in feudal Japan, simply because they had access to good food, clean water, and shelter. But they faced their own health challenges. The stress of their position could lead to various ailments. The lack of physical exercise beyond the gentle movements of daily life and artistic practice meant they often had poor fitness. And they faced the specific health risks associated with childbearing. Multiple pregnancies took a toll on the body, and the dangers of childbirth meant that many concubines died young, despite their generally privileged material circumstances. Mental health challenges were probably common, though they weren't understood or addressed in the way we would approach them today. The isolation, the lack of autonomy, the constant performance, the anxiety about status and favor, all of these factors must have created significant psychological stress. Some women probably experienced what we would now recognize as depression or anxiety disorders. Others might have developed ways of coping that were not particularly healthy, perhaps becoming numb or detached, perhaps developing rigid obsessions with ritual and propriety as a way of exerting some control over an uncontrollable situation. The household probably tolerated a certain amount of eccentric behavior from concubines as long as it didn't create serious problems. A woman who became too difficult or unstable, however, would likely be removed. Let's return once more to Hana and observe her dealing with a crisis, because life in a concubine household was not always predictable or manageable, and sometimes events occurred that tested everyone's ability to navigate difficult situations. It's now been about a year since we first met Hana, and she's 23 years old. She's been in the household for 7 years, long enough to have established herself as a senior concubine with considerable status. She's borne no children, which is a source of ongoing disappointment and anxiety, but she's maintained the Lord's favor through her accomplishments and demeanor. She's become friends with Yuki, the older concubine, and they've developed a relationship of mutual support and genuine affection. Suzume, the younger concubine, has been dismissed from the household. The official reason was some minor infraction of etiquette, but everyone understood that the real reason was that the Lord had lost interest in her, and without his favor, she had no protection when the legitimate wife decided she wanted her gone. The crisis begins one evening when Hana is summoned to the Lord's quarters unexpectedly. These unscheduled summons are always somewhat alarming because they suggest something unusual is happening. When she arrives, she finds her lord in an agitated state. He paces the room, and when he sees her, he waves away the servants so they're alone. Then he tells her that there's been a serious political development. A rival daimyo has made accusations against him, claiming mismanagement of his domain and suggesting disloyalty to the shogun. The accusations are false, or at least exaggerated, but they're serious enough that they must be addressed. There will be an investigation. Officials from the shogunate will come to the domain, and everything in the household will be scrutinized. He tells Hana this not because he needs her advice on political matters, but because he needs someone to talk to, someone who will listen sympathetically without judgment. His wife is too connected to political factions to be truly safe to confide in. His advisors are all implicated in the accusations and are too anxious about their own positions. So he turns to Hana, and she listens carefully as he pours out his worries and frustrations. She responds with sympathy and reassurance, not offering foolish advice about matters she doesn't understand, but simply being a supportive presence. This is another aspect of a concubine's role, being emotionally available, providing comfort and understanding when the Lord needs it. But the implications of this crisis extend far beyond this one evening. If the accusations are upheld, if the Lord is found guilty of mismanagement or disloyalty, the consequences could be devastating. He could lose his domain, his position, possibly even his life. And if that happens, what becomes of his household? The legitimate wife and children would probably be absorbed into her family's household, protected by those connections. But the concubines? They would likely be dismissed, sent away with whatever small stipend the household could afford, left to make their way in a world that had limited options for women in their position. This is the nightmare scenario that every concubine fears, the sudden collapse of the structure that supports them. Over the following weeks, the household is thrown into turmoil. the shogunate officials arrive and begin their investigation. They interview retainers and servants. They examine records and accounts. They tour the domain, observing conditions. The household is required to host these officials, to provide them with the best accommodations and food, to be constantly available to answer questions and provide information. Everyone is on edge, trying to present the best possible face, while knowing that their futures hang in the balance. The concubine's role during this period is to stay out of the way as much as possible while being available if needed. They maintain their normal routines, but everything feels different, shadowed by anxiety and uncertainty. Hana finds herself unable to sleep well during this period. She lies awake at night, imagining worst-case scenarios. What would she do if she were dismissed? She could try to return to her family, but she knows they're still struggling financially and might not be able or willing to support her. She could try to find a position in another household, but at 23, after 7 years as a concubine, what were her prospects? Other households would be suspicious of a dismissed concubine, wondering what she had done wrong, whether she brought bad luck or poor judgment. She might end up in a much less desirable situation, in a poorer household, or in the pleasure quarters. Or she might have no options at all and end up in a temple, if she was fortunate, or on the streets if she was not. These thoughts circle through her mind in the dark hours, creating a kind of panic that she has to actively suppress during the day. The investigation drags on for nearly 2 months, and then, finally, word comes. The accusations have been largely dismissed. Some minor mismanagement has been acknowledged, requiring a small fine and some administrative reforms, but there are no serious consequences. The Lord is not being removed from his position. The household will continue. The relief is palpable, spreading through the compound like a wave. Everyone had been holding their breath, and now they can finally breathe again. The shogunate officials depart, and life slowly returns to something like normal. But the experience has left its mark on Hana. She's been forcibly reminded of how precarious her position really is, how dependent she is on circumstances beyond her control. The Lord could fall from favor, or he could simply die. He's currently in his early 50s, which is not young by the standards of the time, and any number of things could happen to him. And then what would become of her? She realizes that she needs to prepare for possibilities she's been trying not to think about. She begins to be more careful with the small stipend she receives, saving as much as she can. She cultivates relationships with servants and retainers who might help her if she needs information or assistance. She even starts to tentatively explore what it would take to secure a place in a temple, just as a backup option if everything else falls apart. This crisis and its aftermath represent a turning point in Hana's understanding of her situation. She's moved from a kind of day-to-day pragmatism, just dealing with immediate concerns, to a longer-term strategic thinking about her future. She's still performing all her usual roles, still maintaining her appearance and skills, still being available and gracious and accomplished. But underneath, there's a new awareness, a new determination to create what security she can in an insecure world. It makes her harder in some ways, less willing to simply accept whatever comes. But it also makes her more focused, more intentional about her choices and actions. The years continue to pass, And we can fast forward through several of them to see how Hana's life evolves. She turns 25, then 28, then 30. She's now definitely among the senior concubines, one of the women who has been in the household the longest. She's still maintained the Lord's favor, though she's summoned less frequently than she once was. This is partly because she's aging, no longer the young woman she was, but it's also because the Lord himself is aging, his interests and energies changing. He seems less interested in intimate encounters and more interested in conversation and companionship, which actually plays to Hana's strengths. She's become an excellent conversationalist, well-read and thoughtful, able to discuss poetry, history, and even some political matters with intelligence and discretion. During these years, new concubines have arrived in the household. There's a girl named Kiku, only 17 when she arrives, and Hana finds herself in the position of senior mentor. She remembers how frightened and confused she was when she first came to this household, and she tries to ease Kiku's transition, offering advice and guidance, explaining the unwritten rules and the personalities of the key household members. This mentoring role gives Hana a new sense of purpose. She's no longer just performing for the Lord's pleasure. She's helping shape the next generation of women in the household, passing on knowledge and skills, creating a kind of continuity. She's also taken on some administrative responsibilities. The woman who previously managed much of the concubines' wing, the one called Ume, has retired to a temple, and Hana has been chosen to take over some of her duties. She now helps coordinate the concubines' schedules, manages the allocation of shared resources like musical instruments and art supplies, and serves as a liaison between the concubines and the household's senior administration. This role doesn't come with any official title or significant additional stipend, but it does give her a measure of authority and security. She's no longer just a decorative object. She's a functionary, someone the household depends on for smooth operations. Her relationship with Yuki has deepened over the years into genuine friendship. They've been through so much together, seen so many women come and go, weathered so many household crises. They've developed their own private language of looks and gestures, can communicate entire thoughts with the slightest movement of an eyebrow or shift of expression. They spend many evenings together, sometimes working on their respective artistic projects in companionable silence, sometimes talking late into the night about their lives, their memories, their hopes and fears. Yuki is now in her early 40s and has largely given up hope of ever bearing a child. She's made peace with remaining in this household for the rest of her life, focusing on her calligraphy and on maintaining cordial relationships with everyone. She's become a kind of neutral elder stateswoman, someone people turn to for advice and mediation when conflicts arise. Hana herself has not made complete peace with her childlessness. It still hurts, this failure to fulfill what was supposed to be essential purpose of her role. She's tried various remedies over the years, consulted with midwives and healers, made offerings at shrines and temples, but nothing has worked. She's forced to accept that she will probably never be a mother, at least not in the biological sense. But she's found other ways to exercise nurturing impulses. Her mentoring of younger concubines is one outlet. She's also become involved in teaching some of the servants' children, helping them learn to read and write, sharing stories and songs. These activities fall outside her official duties, but they give her satisfaction and make her feel useful in ways that her formal role sometimes doesn't. The household itself has changed over the years. The Lord's eldest son, now an adult with his own family, has moved into a separate residence within the compound, essentially creating a sub-household. The Lord's wife is aging and has become more reclusive, spending most of her time in her own quarters with her ladies-in-waiting. The Lord himself has developed health problems, nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to slow him down, to make him more cautious and contemplative. The whole atmosphere of the household has become more subdued, less formal, almost melancholy in its awareness of time passing and lives winding down. During this period, Hana has also become more religious. Not in any dramatic conversion experience, but through a gradual deepening of engagement with Buddhist practice. She spends more time at the household shrine, not just performing perfunctory rituals, but actually meditating, studying sutras, trying to understand the teachings. She finds comfort in the Buddhist emphasis on detachment from worldly concerns, on accepting impermanence and suffering as fundamental aspects of existence. It provides a philosophical framework for understanding her life that makes it more bearable. If everything is temporary, if suffering is universal, if the self is ultimately an illusion, then her particular struggles and disappointments become less personal, less painful. They're just part of the great universal pattern. She's also begun to seriously consider what will happen when the Lord dies, because at his age and with his health issues, this is no longer a distant theoretical concern, but a practical matter that requires planning. She's saved a modest sum over the years, enough to support herself for a few years if necessary. She's cultivated a relationship with a nearby temple, making regular donations and becoming known to the abbess. She's explored the possibility of retiring there eventually, and the abbess has indicated that she would be welcome, though of course this would require a substantial donation to the temple. Hana is working toward being able to make that donation, carefully accumulating resources, preparing for a future that she can at least partly control. But despite all these preparations and adaptations, there are still moments when Hana feels the full weight of her situation, when the elaborate coping mechanisms fall away and she confronts the reality of her life. These moments often come at night, when she's alone in her room and the compound is quiet. She lies on her futon and thinks about the girl she was at 16, about the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. She might have married a man of similar social status, might have had her own household to manage, might have raised children and grown old surrounded by family. Instead, she's here, approaching middle age, with no children, no husband, no family except the artificial one of the household, no security except what she's been able to carefully construct for herself. These moments of darkness and doubt are part of her reality, but they're not the whole reality. Because there are also moments of genuine pleasure and satisfaction. The first warm day of spring, when she can sit in the garden without a shawl and watch the cherry blossoms beginning to open. The moment in a musical performance when everything comes together perfectly, and she loses herself in the beauty of the sound. The quiet satisfaction of helping a younger woman avoid a mistake or learn a difficult skill. The comfort of friendship with Yuki, the knowledge that she's not entirely alone. The taste of particularly good tea, the feel of silk under her fingers, the sight of her own calligraphy improving year by year. These small pleasures don't erase the fundamental constraints and disappointments of her life, but they make it livable, even occasionally joyful. And so her life continues, day by day, season by season. She performs her roles, maintains her skills, navigates relationships, prepares for an uncertain future. She's become very good at this life, adept at all its requirements and challenges. But she's also accumulated questions that have no good answers. What does it mean to live a good life when you have so little control over your circumstances? How do you find meaning and purpose when your role is fundamentally about serving others? How do you maintain your sense of self when so much of your identity is defined by external expectations and requirements? These are not questions that Hana can answer definitively, but she thinks about them, wrestles with them, tries to live into whatever answers she can find. Let's now examine some of the alternative paths that concubines' lives could take, because Hana's experience, while typical in many ways, is just one possibility among many. Some concubines did achieve the goal of bearing a son who survived and thrived. For these women, life took a very different trajectory. A concubine who produced a male heir, particularly if the legitimate wife had not done so, could become extremely powerful within the household. She would be guaranteed lifelong support, and she would have a say in her son's upbringing and future. If her son eventually succeeded to his father's position, she could become the power behind the throne, exercising enormous influence over the domain's affairs. History provides examples of concubines who leveraged their position as mothers into real political power, becoming advisors and decision-makers in all but name. But this path came with its own complications and dangers. A concubine who produced a potential heir became a threat to the legitimate wife and her children. This could lead to intense, sometimes dangerous conflicts within the household. There are historical accounts of concubines being eliminated, sometimes through poison or other means, when their sons became too promising or threatening. The legitimate wife had her own heirs to protect, and she might be ruthless in defending their interests. So while motherhood could elevate a concubine's status, it could also put her in increased danger. Other concubines found their way out of the household through various means. Some were able to marry, either because the Lord arranged marriages for them, or because they managed to form relationships with retainers or others who were willing to marry them. These marriages were usually to men of relatively low status, since a former concubine carried a certain stigma, but they at least provided a path to a more conventional life with greater autonomy. A concubine who married left the household with whatever stipend or gifts the Lord chose to provide, and then she entered a new life as someone's wife, with all the different challenges and opportunities that entailed. Some concubines did end up in temples, either by choice or necessity. For women who were genuinely religious or who simply wanted a peaceful retirement, a temple could be an acceptable destination. The life was simple and structured, focused on religious practice and study, removed from the complexities and stresses of household politics. But temple life also required its own adaptations. You were giving up what remained of worldly pleasures and comforts, committing to a life of austerity and discipline. And not all temples were equally welcoming or comfortable. The quality of life in a temple depended on factors like the temple's wealth, the personality of the abbess, and how much of a donation you brought with you. The less fortunate concubines, those who were dismissed without adequate support or who found themselves stranded when a household collapsed, faced much grimmer prospects. Some ended up in the pleasure quarters, using the skills they had developed as concubines in a commercial context. Others became servants in less prestigious households, trading on whatever connections or skills they had. The most unfortunate might end up as common laborers or even beggars. The fall from concubine to destitute was entirely possible, and the awareness of this possibility haunted many women throughout their time in service. There were also concubines who simply disappeared from the historical record, and we can only speculate about their fates. They might have died young from disease or childbirth. They might have been dismissed and returned to obscure lives with their families. They might have entered temples or taken other paths that left no trace in the documents that survived. The fragmentary nature of the historical record means that for every concubine whose story we know something about, there are countless others who lived and died leaving no mark, their experiences and feelings lost to time. The historical sources about concubines are themselves problematic and limited. Most were written by men, from male perspectives, reflecting male concerns and interests. Concubines appear in these sources primarily when they affect political outcomes or when they do something scandalous or noteworthy. Concubines, their inner lives, their thoughts and feelings, their daily experiences, these are largely absent from the official historical record. We do have some poems and diary entries from women who were concubines, and these provide precious glimpses into their subjective experiences. But these sources are rare, and they come primarily from the most educated, most privileged concubines who had the literacy and leisure to write. The experiences of less educated, less favored concubines are even more opaque to us. What we can say with confidence is that being a concubine in feudal Japan was a complex experience that combined elements of privilege and constraint, luxury and vulnerability, opportunity and exploitation. It was a role that allowed some women to live in greater material comfort than they would have otherwise enjoyed, to develop artistic and intellectual skills, to participate in elite culture. But it was also a role that required the surrender of autonomy, that placed women in positions of dependence and constant evaluation, that offered no guarantees of security or happiness. Whether any individual concubine experienced her life as primarily positive or primarily negative probably depended on countless factors. Her personality, her particular circumstances, the characters of the people she lived with, her health, her luck, her ability to find meaning and satisfaction within tight constraints. From a modern perspective, it's easy to judge the system of concubinage as unjust, as a form of exploitation that treated women as property and denied them fundamental rights and dignity. And there's truth in that judgment. But it's also important to avoid simple moral condemnation that fails to understand the system in its own context. Feudal Japan was a society organized around very different principles than modern democratic societies. Ideas about individual rights, personal autonomy, and gender equality that we take for granted simply didn't exist in that context. People understood their lives through different frameworks, emphasizing duty, status, family honor, and social harmony rather than individual freedom and self-actualization. This doesn't mean that people in feudal Japan didn't value happiness or didn't struggle with the limitations of their roles. Of course they did. Human beings in all times and places want to be happy, want to be valued, want their lives to have meaning. But the paths to achieving these things and the very definitions of these concepts vary enormously across cultures and historical periods. A woman in feudal Japan might find satisfaction and meaning in perfectly executing a tea ceremony, in composing an elegant poem, in bearing a child who honored his ancestors, in maintaining harmonious relationships within her household. These sources of meaning might seem limited or insufficient to us, but within their own context, they were real and important. The system of concubinage eventually came to an end, not through internal reform, but through the massive social changes that swept through Japan in the late 19th century. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the beginning of Japan's rapid modernization, as the country opened to Western influence and began transforming itself into a modern nation-state. The feudal system was abolished. The domains were reorganized into prefectures, and the samurai class lost its special status. Along with these changes came new legal codes and new social norms, many borrowed or adapted from Western models. Concubinage continued to exist for a while in various forms, but it was increasingly seen as backwards and incompatible with modern civilized society. By the early 20th century, concubinage had largely disappeared among the elite classes, though various forms of kept women and informal arrangements continued. The position of women in Japanese society changed dramatically, though not always in straightforward or uniformly positive ways. Women gained access to education and eventually to various forms of work and political participation. But they also faced new forms of constraint and expectation as Japan navigated the complex process of modernization while trying to maintain aspects of traditional culture and values. The complete transformation of gender roles and relations is still ongoing in Japan, as in many societies, with continuing debates about women's work, marriage, family responsibilities, and social status. For the women who actually lived as concubines during the feudal period, modernization came too late. They lived out their lives within the system that existed, navigating it as best they could, finding what satisfaction and meaning they could, and passing into history. Their stories survive in fragments, a poem here, a diary entry there, references in household records and political documents. From these fragments, we can reconstruct something of what their lives were like, though much remains mysterious and unknowable. Let's return one final time to Hana and see how her story concludes. It's now been 15 years since she first entered the household, and she's 31 years old. She's 31 years old. The Lord has died, finally succumbing to the various ailments that had been troubling him for years. His death was not unexpected, but it still creates upheaval throughout the household as power transitions to his eldest son, who now becomes the new lord. The son's wife, formerly a relatively minor figure in the household hierarchy, is now the senior lady, and she has her own ideas about how things should be organized. One of her first decisions is to reduce the number of concubines. She announces that the household will maintain only 2 concubines, those who are youngest and most favored by the new lord. The others will be given stipends and sent away, either to return to their families, to enter temples, or to make whatever arrangements they can. This is not done with particular cruelty, just practical housekeeping. The new lord is younger and has different tastes than his father, and the new lady wants to establish her authority and reduce expenses. Hana receives the news with resignation rather than surprise. She's been preparing for this possibility for years, and she has her plans in place. She accepts the stipend she's offered, which is modest but not insulting, and she takes her leave of the household where she spent her entire adult life. She says goodbye to Yuki, who is also being dismissed, and to the younger concubines who are staying. She collects her few personal possessions, her clothing, her writing materials, some poems and calligraphy she's created over the years, a few gifts and mementos. Everything she owns fits into a single trunk and a few packages. She makes her way to the temple she's been cultivating a relationship with, and the abbess receives her as expected. Hana makes her donation, a substantial portion of her savings, and she's accepted into the temple community. She takes the tonsure, having her head shaved and receiving a religious name. She's no longer Hana the concubine. She's now a Buddhist nun, and she enters yet another new phase of her life. Temple life is very different from life in the Lord's household. It's simpler, more austere, more focused on spiritual practice rather than aesthetic refinement. But in some ways, it's also easier. The expectations are clearer, the hierarchies less ambiguous. There's a routine of prayer and meditation, work and study. Hana finds herself surprisingly well suited to it. The skills she developed as a concubine, the discipline, the ability to follow complex protocols, the cultivation of inner calm, all of these serve her well in her new role. She becomes known for her beautiful calligraphy, and she spends many hours copying sutras, creating works of religious art that the temple uses in its ceremonies and teaching. She also teaches, passing on her literacy and artistic skills to younger nuns and to the children who come to the temple for education. She discovers that she's a good teacher, patient and clear, able to break down complex skills into learnable steps. This teaching gives her a sense of purpose that she didn't always feel as a concubine. She's not just maintaining herself or serving others' pleasure. She's helping people learn and grow, passing on knowledge that will outlast her. She lives in the temple for another 20 years, dying finally at the age of 51, which is considered a good age. She dies peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the other nuns who have become her community. After her death, they discover the poems she's been writing throughout her life, carefully preserved and added to over the decades. They're not masterpieces, these poems, but they're good enough, honest enough to be valued. The temple preserves them, and some are even copied and shared with other temples. So Hana achieves, in a small way, the immortality she sometimes dreamed of. Her verses survive her, providing future readers with a window into her life and thoughts, evidence that she existed and that her existence had meaning. This is one possible ending for a concubine story, and it's relatively positive, all things considered. Hana has security, purpose, community, and peace in her final years. Not all concubines were so fortunate, but her story illustrates the possibilities and limitations of the life, the ways women navigated a difficult system, the resilience and adaptability they showed in dealing with circumstances they couldn't control. She never had the life she might have chosen for herself, never had the autonomy and security that we would consider basic human rights. But she made the best of the life she had, found satisfaction where she could, maintained her dignity and humanity through all the performances and constraints, and left behind something of herself for future generations to remember. In conclusion, the life of a concubine in feudal Japan was a complex tapestry woven from threads of privilege and constraint, beauty and loneliness, skill and submission. These women existed in a fascinating but difficult position, neither fully free nor entirely enslaved, neither family members nor simple servants. They were expected to be accomplished artists and gracious companions while having virtually no control over their own destinies. They had to be constantly vigilant, constantly performing, constantly aware of their precarious position in a hierarchical social order that valued them for their youth, beauty, and refinement, but offered them little security or autonomy. Some found ways to create meaningful lives within these constraints, developing genuine skills and relationships, finding purpose and satisfaction in what they could control. Others suffered under the weight of expectations and limitations, their lives marked by anxiety, disappointment, and frustrated potential. All of them were real people with complex inner lives, trying to make sense of and find happiness in the circumstances they were given. Their stories remind us that throughout history, people have lived in systems very different from our own, have found ways to be human and to seek meaning even within tight constraints, and have left behind traces of their existence that allow us, centuries later, to glimpse their world and perhaps understand a little better the vast range of human experience across time and culture. Thanks for watching this video. Good night.